Every year on October 31st, I feel nothing but crippling fear. In truth, I'm not afraid of the supposed ghouls that roam the night. Neither am I afraid of the evil demons that come to take us in the scary tales we tell. There's nothing I fear more than the pitter-patter of little children's feet roaming the street asking for candy. And this gruesome experience will tell you why. This incident happened 3 years ago. I had just bought a newly remodeled house. As I stood in the hallway of my new home, only 2 words ran through my mind. It's beautiful. I had been eyeing the house for a while now and immediately got an opportunity to buy it. I did. The house wasn't only beautiful, it had a reasonable price too, as apparently it had been in a terrible fire, one of which I didn't know the details of. But due to that incident, the house's value was reduced, thus making it cheap, which was one of my incentives to get it in the first place. Buying the house and moving into a new neighborhood was the beginning of a fresh start for me and my 1-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Foster. Being a single mother wasn't easy, but my little baby girl was the light of my life, and I swore to give her the best that I could. The first few months were nothing but perfect. I had completely settled down, and I had made a lot of friends around the neighborhood. After the summer, autumn was fast approaching, and with it, the Halloween season. Decorations began to go up, and I became excited to spend my first Halloween in the new neighborhood. It was on the 31st of October, 2013. The day started out great as people in costumes filled the streets. By the time it was 5:30, I began to hear knocking at the door. I opened up to see the cutest children in costumes, and with a big smile, they said, "Trick or treat." I gladly obliged, and I gave them as much candy as I could. The following hours went the same way as the knocks on the door just kept coming. I didn't complain as the sight warmed my heart, and I began to think how adorable my own daughter would be when she's old enough to dress up and go out for her first trick-or-treating. I stayed up giving out candy till it was really late, and at around 10 p.m., the knocks on the door had stopped. I realized I was out of candy, and I decided to call it a night. So I turned off the lights before going to check on my sleeping daughter in her room. After that, I brushed my teeth and I went to bed. I didn't sleep for long before I was abruptly awoken by loud knocks at the door. I looked at the clock beside my bed and it was 12:01 a.m. Perplexed at who was knocking at this hour, I went down to check. I opened the door to see 2 children. It was dark, so I couldn't make out their faces well. The first child was a boy who I assumed was 9 years old, and he held the hand of the second child, a 5-year-old girl who I assumed was his sister. Before I could say anything, they both said, "Trick or treat," in unison. I was completely baffled to see children out at this time, as it was extremely late, so I blurted out, "Whoa, it's really late, kids. I'm guessing you guys should go home. I'm all out of candy." I couldn't see their faces well, but I could tell that they were angry at the fact that I didn't have any candy to give them. So they frowned their faces and said, "Trick or treat." I could notice the anger in their voice as they said that, and I began to get scared, so I said, "You kids should really go home. It's not safe out here, and it's no time for pranks." Nothing but silence answered me as the children stood there staring at me with a hint of anger in their eyes. I assumed they were still trying to pull a prank, so I bid them goodnight before closing the door. I began to make my way upstairs, thinking about how odd the recent occurrence was, and before I could reach my room, I began to hear noises coming from the kitchen. Thinking they were burglars, I rushed down to see what was going on. I reached there to see the 2 children I just saw outside, inside my kitchen, and one of them now held a lighter in their hand. The smell of gas began to fill the room as I looked to the gas cooker and realized it was on full blast. Before I could utter a single word, I heard the sound of the lighter, and I watched my house go up in flames. Within seconds, the fire had spread everywhere as I was surrounded by flames. I watched in horror as my home began to burn. I looked forward to see the children, who were now engulfed in flames, begin to laugh. I watched as the fire peeled off their skin, and the smell of burning flesh began to fill the room. But to my horror, the children who were still completely unfazed continued to laugh as they were burnt alive. The scene was ghastly, and it transfixed me for a while. I began to hear little screams from upstairs, and I realized my daughter was still in her room. "Lizzie!" Before rushing upstairs to her room, Before I could reach the door, a huge chunk of burning debris fell from the roof and blocked my path. I tried to maneuver the blockade, but there was no way as the entrance was completely blocked. I tried to get back down the stairs to get some help, but the stairway was blocked too as the flames were everywhere and the ceiling had begun to crumble around me. In that moment, I felt nothing but helplessness, hopelessness, and despair as her screams filled the house. Nothing in this world can be compared to what I was feeling as I heard her die and not being able to do anything about it. The pain was unbearable as I was her mother, and in some way, I also felt her die. The smoke began to rise and breathing became extremely hard. I began to choke as I fell to the floor. The world around me began to fade away, and I was beginning to give in. I felt arms grab a hold of me and pick me up from the floor. The following seconds were a blur. But before I knew it, I was out of the house and surrounded by firefighters. I began to scream. "My daughter is still inside! Help her!" They began to rush back in, but the house began to collapse on itself, and I knew that it was hopeless. As I watched the house crumble with my daughter in it, I felt a piece of me die, and I couldn't do anything but cry my heart out. After a while, my grief began to turn into anger as I cursed the children who did it. I decided to call the cops, as with my daughter gone, the only thing I could get now was justice. They escorted me to the police station, and I gave them my statement. They looked at me like I was crazy when I explained to them that the children were laughing as they burnt alive. But I stuck to my story as I knew what I saw. The cops checked the house, and they said they only found the corpse of my 1-year-old daughter, and no other bodies were found. Knowing that they escaped made me more angry, so I demanded that they were found and brought to justice. I was then told to describe the children to the police sketch artist. I tried my best to tell them every detail I could remember, as I didn't see the children well. It took about 3 hours for the sketches to be finished. When it was done, all the cops looked baffled as they saw the final sketch. I was confused as they all began to look at me like I was mad. The elderly cop then asked me, "Are you sure these are the children you saw?" Angered and frustrated, I screamed back, "Yes, it's them. I know what I saw. Now can you please find them and bring them to justice?" The cop then looked at me and said, "Well, that's impossible, ma'am, because if these are the kids you saw, I can assure you that they couldn't have done it, as I knew them very well." I knew something was wrong when he used the word knew, but before I could say anything, he continued with, "These kids perfectly match the description of the Johnsons' children, and the Johnsons are the family who formerly lived in the house that you currently reside in. I can assure you that it is completely impossible that these kids were responsible for the fire, as the family had all horrifically died in a similar house fire 5 years ago." Completely baffled and with nothing to say, I stood up and left the station. While I knew it defied all logic that dead children were responsible for the arson, a part of me believed it, as the odd things I saw that night began to make sense to me. After burying my daughter, I left town to move back in with my mother. Most days, I tell myself that it's too bad there's no justice system for the restless spirits that roam the world, as there was nothing I could do to find solace. Sometimes, I find myself thinking back to that day and wishing I had given them some candy, as I knew that if I did, they would have left me and my daughter alone. I hope my story is a lesson to all of you, as I urge you to fill your house this October with candy and treats to give, as it's better to give a treat than to experience the gruesome trick.